Spirit Switchboard, airing live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3, New Orleans.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Spirit Switchboard. I'm Carrie Lynn Shellhorn. You are listening to us live on 105.3 and 107.7 New Orleans, the United Public Radio Network, and the UFO Paranormal Radio Network. Today, I have on researcher, author, musician, Joshua Cutchin.
Hi,
nice. Do you want me to? Do you go by Joshua? Do you go by Josh?
Oh, you can call me anything you like. My friends tend to call me Josh. A couple of them call me Cutch. So whatever you want to say. Yeah.
For a while there, I used to tell people I get called Butt Mom, so you could choose, depending on what hat I've got on that day.
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, I have twin boys, and I've been getting a lot of butt dads. So yeah, butt dad.
Yeah.
Butt dad works too. Yeah.
Right. So I was thinking about you a lot over this last week, and I was thinking about this episode, and I was thinking about all of those hats that you wear, right? All of these hats that you wear, and I was thinking about path and passion and purpose, and how those roles change for us, and where we think we're going to start off at, and how it morphs as we have different experiences and different information come across to us, right? So that was something I was thinking about when I was preparing for today.
Yeah, it's been, I'm not gonna lie, it's sort of a challenging way to do things. Trying to keep multiple interests pushing forward at the same time, and still trying to have a home life. I guess it's a bit like a battle. Like I gain some ground over here and lose some ground over here, and then I've got to go run over here and compensate. But I still remain pretty active as a musician through a combination of, I guess, hard work and attrition. I've become sort of the first call jazz tuba player for here in Atlanta, which that's, being in New Orleans, I'm sure that's not as strange a concept as a lot of people elsewhere might find it to be. But I still play quite a bit, and then I haven't quite averaged a book a year, but it's kind of getting to that point. Because I tend to write. I've discovered that I write very quickly. So, I just released a novel, which is my first work of fiction. But everything up until now has been nonfiction, or as I prefer to say, speculative nonfiction. It sort of depends on your threshold of what you believe in being possible. But
yeah, I definitely want to tap into that novel a little later if we could.
Sure.
It was definitely. Because I can get ADHD scrolling Red Bull really quickly. I made like a bullet point list and highlighted so I could try to stay on track, because I know me.
Well, and these sort of conversations, in my experience, they often sort of take a detour off the main road quite often, and that's fine with me. So as long as everybody is having a good time, then I'm down for whatever.
Yeah, thank you. I know one of the things that I would really like to start off with, when I originally reached out to you to be on the show, which I'm really grateful that you accepted to come on. Today is my daughter's birthday, and I was thinking about her. But as I was doing that research and preparing for today, and kind of seeing where I wanted to go, my original thought just really went out the window, and I'm like, oh, we're going to have to roll with it. Because I was thinking about my daughter, and this is where my thoughts were going. As she's 26 today. So she's number 3 in a row of 4. So when she was younger, we had moved, we're in Ontario, Canada, and we had moved to Northern Ontario, Canada, where I had grown up. Mm-hmm. And she was in grade 4 at the time. And in our household, there was no fixed no fixed organization, like belief system, religion. It was really kind of a mixed bag of like, I'm kind of curious and interested about this, and I would present it to my kids at the same time too. Like, let's have these different viewpoints, right? Have these different viewpoints. And so we moved up there. Brooklyn is in grade 4, and she comes home from school her first day. It's just before Christmas, and she's crying. And she said, "You didn't tell me that you enrolled me in a Catholic school." And I didn't. I said, this is public school, honey. You're not in Catholic. She said, well, everyone was talking about their traditions and asking about their religion, and I was the only one that said that I was Wiccan. And I went, Wiccan? Like, what the heck? Why would you say Wiccan? She said, everybody else said they were Catholic, and I'm never going to get invited to a birthday party. This is bad. But because there was that pull for her in fairy lore and more of these sort of pagan belief systems, and it's where she was at that point in time. And then you fast forward, she just finished her first year of her PhD, decided she needed to take a year off and ground and regroup and reassess where she's wanting to go with this. And what she discovered through these years of academia, she is definitely steeped in academia. It's where she thrives in that research and information. And you know, when she was doing this past year, her mentor kept saying to her, you are where you're wanting to go is going to push a lot of buttons. It is way outside of the box. Are you sure you want to go there? This is the kid that said she was Wiccan in grade 4 in a room full of Roman Catholic Italian students at a public school. So that's what I was thinking about with you. Like, where did you start, and what was, like, there's a lot to unpack in that, I know. So like, where did you start as a kid, and was there a cultural belief system that you were raised with, and how that morphed into kind of where you're at now, which is very outside of the box, right?
It is. You know, I often joke that my musician friends say, "What's up with all this UFO and supernatural stuff, Josh?" And then my friends in the supernatural paranormal community say, "You play the tuba?" So I'm kind of, I feel like an outsider no matter where I go.
But the music probably grounds you and inspires you and keeps balance for you at the same time, right?
Yeah, as I've said before, on some occasions, it is really nice whenever I become frustrated with one aspect of my life to sort of dive into the other. You know, completing this last book that I just did, this novel, I was kind of just sick of looking at a screen, or looking at words on a screen, I guess. So I ended up writing and arranging some music for the first time in a couple of years, and it felt so good to just use a different part of my brain.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it does, because I think that especially when you're looking at some of these topics, they can get very dark, and I have seen people who sort of chase their way down the rabbit hole and just kind of don't come back out. And yeah, it does sort of help me, you know, to interface with the real world as it is. Not that I don't think that these things have an objective reality. That's neither here nor there. But tell your daughter.
What is real is a whole other conversation.
Right, exactly. It helps me interface with consensus reality. How about that?
Yes.
Yeah, tell your daughter to stay the course. I mean, people who think outside the box do interesting things, and as long as you can bring the receipts for what you're saying, you know, in my experience, there's a good reception, you know, waiting at the other end, as long as you're backing up what you're saying and saying, hey, look at this. This is, you know, the body of work, the scholarship, the thinking that led to this point. For me, I grew up in a Christian household, but we were always very open to supernatural things. I mean, you know, we weren't doing Reiki or anything, but you know, the idea of ghosts or Bigfoot, or even to a certain degree UFOs, was never, you know, frowned upon. And my parents were always encouraging me to read, and you know, sort of the attitude was, well, if he's reading a book on Bigfoot, then at least he's reading, right? But you know, I sort of had my own sort of things that I was interested in more than other things, and for a long time in my adolescence, it was the Bigfoot thing. But I always had an interest in a lot of different topics, and it was probably, you know, it sort of continued on and off throughout my life. And I got one of my first desk jobs in 2012, and I had an hour-long commute, and you know, it somehow seems a lot longer ago and a lot shorter ago, but I look back on 2012, I'm like, that was sort of the Wild West of podcasts. Yet there are a lot more podcasts now, but like the manner in which they were sort of sprouting up and, you know, sort of just long form discussions, it felt very new and very exciting. And so I ended up really leaning into that interest of mine, that paranormal interest, and started listening to some podcasts that sort of reframed some questions that I had in some interesting ways. And I guess I just sort of learned through osmosis for a while. And I just percolated on a lot of these topics. And it was probably in 2014, I got a gift card from Amazon from my sister-in-law for just to buy a book. And I said, you know what? It's been a while since I've bought a spooky, weird book. I'm going to buy a Bigfoot book. And I bought J. Robert Alley's Raincoast Sasquatch, which is all about indigenous beliefs regarding Bigfoot along the coast of Alaska. And he mentions how one of the tribes up there, their Bigfoot analog, known as the Bequas, it's believed that if you encounter a Bequas and the Bequas offers you food and you take it and eat it, you'll be trapped with the Bequas forever. And I said, hang on a minute, because, you know, I've been listening to all these different podcasts and sort of just integrating all this information. I said, that sounds a lot like Western European fairy folklore, where if you take food from the fairies in fairyland, you're stuck there. I'm like, how does that cultural belief get transmitted? And, you know, to me it implied one of three things. It implied that, you know, there is a collective unconscious of archetypes that we all draw upon, which is amazing, right? If that's an actual thing, right? Or it implies that there was more cultural transmission in the ancient past between, you know, the New World and Old World than we recognize, which is also amazing. Or most amazingly, it implies that there's some sort of objective reality to these things. So I think that those are kind of the only three options that you have when faced with that congruency of people, you know, across an entire ocean sharing similar cultural beliefs regarding the supernatural. So I said, hey, somebody should write a book on this. And I kind of sat there for a while and thought about it for a couple of weeks. And I said, oh, I guess maybe, you know, I'm being called to some degree to write about it. So, you know, that's a big decision. Your name doesn't make it past the first round of a lot of job interviews after you do that, you know.
This was the conversation with my daughter, right? Like,
yeah.
You know, and maybe why. And again, this is something that I was thinking about when I was thinking about you and preparing for today, that, you know, it was extremely brave to step outside of the box and pick up these pieces that you noticed weren't being delved into more. And how can, you know, that you took these pieces and opened it wide open.
Yeah, it was a transformative moment, and something that I really should have done a long time ago, because I have a master's degree in journalism and a master's degree in music, and I was sort of using those. I was going to do like an arts PR kind of career trajectory, and I was working at the university, and I got so fed up with just the bureaucracy and everything of being at the university that I decided to just teach lessons and write. And because, you know, so actually the release of my first book, A Trojan Feast, which was all about the exchange of food and drink and these encounters with other beings, that coincided with my resignation from my day job. And it was like stepping out into the wilderness.
Right.
But, you know, I took it and I ran with it. And now 8 years later, I have, depending on how you count, 8-ish, 9-ish books under my belt, and it's turned into something that, you know, between that and my music actually cobbles together and looks like a living. So it's really surprising. And that first book, I just can't emphasize how warmly and enthusiastically and positively a lot of these communities, you know, received that. There were people who were, you know, reviewing it in a good way. People whom I had read their books in middle school, you know, so it was a really odd juxtaposition to sort of, you know, see those two, you know, to have that sort of level of interaction and discourse with these people to whom I'd looked up for so long. And so that sort of formed the backbone for a lot of my work, which is sort of this interdisciplinary comparative folklore, really, is what it gets right down to. And it's looking at a lot of the modern UFO phenomena through things other than this sort of tired old 1950s sci-fi extraterrestrials from another planet idea. There's a lot of interesting things, a lot of compelling things that point in that direction, but there are also things that point to, you know, time traveling, and there's things that point to, like, you know, the older fairy faith that we're going to talk about, and just all these other connections, where the UFO itself has become sort of a repository and a collecting house for a lot of the mythologies that we've abandoned since.
Have you found that, you know, I've had this ability of being able to see and hear what others can't, right? From the time that I was little. But I did hairstyling first.
But I can see how that could be kind of a useful skill in that situation, though, because you're so close with people and you're having a lot of interactions with people, and I can see how
intimate.
I can see how that sort of environment would almost sort of nurture that ability to a degree, right?
I suppose, but, you know, at a very young age, we kind of learn to conform so that we don't stand out, right? We want to fit in with the crowd. So stepping out and saying, you know, and I call it the witchy woo closet, but I'm not necessarily attached. So this is probably why my daughter was confused in saying that she was Wiccan. Right. It was the language that I was using, which is still part of where I'm going to go with this. Like, when thieves in the night, and when we're talking about fairies and death is a really hard conversation for people to have, and it's a conversation that gets ignored, and it's uncomfortable for people. But when you look at fairies, you know, you did such a great job in presenting here's where this overlays, and
yeah, I mean, it's been something that I've just found attractive from the first moment that I heard it, which was this idea that a lot of the UFO contact experiences, maybe not the stuff that we're seeing with military cameras, recording craft, and things like that, but the actual contact experience between human beings and some sort of other intelligence, the comparison of that to older folklore, and particularly fairy folklore, and particularly fairy folklore from Western Europe, I always found that to be a really interesting avenue of inquiry. And a lot of it stems from Jacques Vallée's 1969 book Passport to Magonia, and he sort of made a very broad comparison to how, you know, this older fairy folklore, and we can define fairies here in a little bit if you want to, but how these motifs that were associated with arguably a laughable concept in modern thought still nonetheless pop up time and again with people who claim that they're encountering extraterrestrials in these UFO experiences. And I just sort of took that and I said, how close of a match is this? And the more I dig, the more it just keeps on yielding more and more similarities that not even Vallée really pointed out. You know, not the least of which, as you alluded to, was the connection between death. That is something that Jacques Vallée didn't really talk about, that I ended up talking about in my latest nonfiction book, Ecology of Souls, that was released last year. Yeah. And there
was no way for me to get through those 3 volumes before today.
I totally get it. But you know, it's like, you know, if you want to really silence conversations at your next family reunion, either pass gas or talk about UFOs and death, right? You know, so it's just such a taboo topic. But throughout the years of UFO contact, there has been this recurring theme of something to do with death that keeps on popping up. And of course, that was one of the original ways that the fairies were thought of, arguably wherever little people are seen on all the inhabited continents of the world. But again, looking at Western Europe specifically, you know, prior to the late 19th century, fairies were oftentimes associated with the dead in some form or fashion, either as being the dead or taking you to the afterlife, or being seen with the dead in their company, or you know, any number of things like that. I had mentioned that sort of prohibition on consuming food in fairyland as sort of being the foundation of my first book. And a lot of times in those stories, it's a dead relative or a dead neighbor who tells the person when they visit fairyland, when they visit the fairy palace or something, the dead person is the one who says, hey, don't eat or drink anything here, or else you'll be stuck here. So yeah, that theme and thread of keeps on coming back up. There's the theme, as you alluded to, and discussing Thieves in the Night, which is my work from 2018, of supernatural child abduction that appears both in the UFO mythos and the fairy stuff too. So it's been such a rich and rewarding foundation to sort of build off of. And of course, we always stand on the shoulders of giants, and I'm no exception. But it's been a treasure trove, and it's been a privilege to sort of take a look at this through that angle. And
so how do you start that process of research? It's not like you're going to cite Reddit,
right? Well,
but you probably get a nugget off the table in Reddit.
Yeah. Here's the thing, because I've thought long and hard about it. There are problems. I don't cite Reddit in any of my books, and I think that's a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because it's just somebody on Reddit, right?
Yeah.
but it's also a bad thing, because I'm convinced that there's a significant portion of people who are saying things on Reddit that are being completely honest. I mean, overall, I tend to think that we vastly overestimate the number of outright hoaxers. I prefer to believe that people tend to act in good faith and are just misidentifying things, or confused, or really believe what they saw. For my purposes, I don't usually cite Reddit, and that's where it kind of is a point of frustration for me personally, because I can not remember things that my children have said, but I can remember the details of a supposed UFO crash in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, or something. You know what I mean? It's, for some reason, I just tend to latch onto these things, and I guess my brain starts making connections. But I have a pretty big library. By now, I have a really good network of people whom I can ask for leads and stuff. But it really is just sort of about taking in folklore from a diverse array of sources, North American folklore, South American folklore, European folklore, Asian folklore, Australian folklore, African folklore, all the inhabited continents, and just trying to sort of remember. And after a while, you sort of get a feeling, because you start to see kind of these similar motifs, pop up time and again. But yeah, and then it's just, for my own writing styles, I just have a bunch of bullet points in a Word document, and I organize them and I work my way through it. But yeah, I have been lucky enough to have a large collection of resources, and it does have that sort of snowball effect where you end up collecting more books with each book, and you end up with a library, and you're like, okay, well, I have a lot to choose from here. So
and what about access, like different universities and university libraries as well too?
Yeah, with the exception of Ecology of Souls, because it was written during the ongoing pandemic, I always, as I sort of look for different threads of research across the internet, because even though I don't cite a lot of things from the internet, I often find things through the internet. You know what I mean?
Right.
Paper books that I find through the internet. Oh, there's a reference to this in this book. I should check this book out. With the exception of Ecology of Souls, I've always, made a visit to the local university library here, which is a great resource. And even if you don't have a membership, you can usually go into the library and take a book off the shelves and take a look through it and get a sense if it's something that you would need or not. So that's been a great resource. Interlibrary loan has been a great resource. And quite frankly, I know some folks will probably think this is kind of cheating, but Google Books is a great resource too. I mean, the number of books that have been digitized, so that you can at least know, again, where to start looking for stuff when you're in those physical sources. It's been such an incredible help. All of my books have been, to a degree, a product of the internet, even though it's not based on accounts from the internet, so to speak.
Right. And do you find, like, I know it still happens for me, and I'm 16 years in doing what I'm doing now. That's a full-time career, right? In meeting somebody new and saying, here, this is who I am and how you can find me, sort of thing. And people will respond saying, well, I don't necessarily believe in that, but I do have, a ghost story for you.
Yeah. No, it's always amazing to me, you run into these people who, claim that they've never had anything paranormal or supernatural happen in their life. And, get a little bit further into the conversation, they'll say, well, there was this one time that, and then they'll
Yeah.
open up about it. Yeah, that's super common. And it's led me to suspect, over the years that these experiences are a lot more common than we realize. Not only in terms of like the dramatic stuff, but you see something strange out of the corner of your eye and you look and you don't see it again. You're like, okay, well, it was nothing. And like, well, maybe that was something, you can never tell. So I do think that we sort of filter out a lot of these experiences and only the most dramatic bubble up to the surface of our awareness. Yeah.
And is it filtered because of cultural beliefs, religion, how we're brought up?
All of the above.
All of the above.
Latent sensitivity. I'm of the opinion that everybody probably has the ability for psychic sensitivity and sensitivity to these things, but some of us have to work at it more than others, just the way that some of us have to work at our artistic skills more than others. I mean, I'm a prime example of that. I am a musician, but I have some friends who can just pick up anything and start playing it, and I'm like, that's not not the way my brain was wired. I have to work at it a little bit more. So yeah, I do think it's a combination of cultural factoring, and I think we underestimate the importance of language and how language sort of erects a structure to our reality and makes us feel it helps us to understand things, but all the words that we use are just placeholders for the actual reality of the thing itself. And I think that can be limiting to a certain degree as well. I mean, there was an Italian anthropologist by the name of Ernesto Di Martino who suggested that actual magical occurrences, miracles, and things of the like, tend to occur more often in cultures that believe in them and that talk about them. And that's after looking at sort of this whole milieu of the supernatural and the paranormal. Anecdotally, that certainly seems to bear itself out. I think that there are certain cultures in the world that just have this sort of magical worldview, and sometimes you don't hear about the stories from those parts of the world because it's considered something of everyday life. Whereas here, speaking in the West and in North America, we've been told that these things don't or can't exist. So, the best that we can muster, as evidenced by the summer of 2023, is, maybe there are people in machines coming from other planets, because it still fits in that very sort of mechanistic, materialistic, physicalist interpretation of the universe. So, yeah, I do think that there's something to that there are certain restrictions that we have on our reality that sort of dictate what we can and can't see and perceive.
Yeah. And then you talk to somebody who's done a trip on ayahuasca and they've got a whole other...
Yeah, well, that's all about kicking down those barriers, right? Yeah, it's really interesting to have watched, even in the short time that I've been sort of peripherally aware, the sort of psychedelic renaissance as it sort of unfolded, and the shifting of the framework of talking about these things as hallucinations, or these people are druggies or something like that, and into actually like looking at it as a mode of consciousness with perhaps its own benefits, and that's certainly the way that the medical literature is going, looking at things like psilocybin, ketamine.
Awareness, right?
And so it's exciting, and it's I think it's kind of a place that we should have been for a long time, which is like, these experiences are not for everyone. I myself can say that they're probably not for me. I have a bunch of different considerations for why I haven't traveled that path myself. So they're not for they're not for everyone, but they are exactly the right thing for some people, I think.
Even just using language for people who, if we talk about synchronicities, so they start paying attention to these synchronicities, and the more they pay attention, the more that happens. But
right.
The same goes for, if you have, you just get your new car and it's a Volkswagen Beetle, then you're seeing beetles everywhere on the road, right?
Yeah, I've read the sort of reductionist explanations for that, but when you're caught up in the midst of it, it doesn't feel like that's the case, does it? It feels like you're actually seeing more of the car. Exactly. I kind of think that sometimes we end up reverse engineering these really rational explanations into things. Another example that I think is a good sort of idea to play with is this idea of pareidolia. Like, I'm not saying that the face that you see in the clouds is anything, but I'm saying that it probably was the inspiration for certain supernatural things. And I think that supernatural phenomena probably, if they do exist, could manifest through pareidolia. But every time you see it, people just go, "Oh, pareidolia." They just sort of wave their hand
end
and
the
move on.
conversation.
Yeah, so every now and then, I'm staring at the trunk of a tree and I'll see a face and I'll kind of interact with it a little bit. Not that I actually think that there's something in the tree necessarily. There might be, but just
why couldn't there be?
Exactly. And why couldn't that be an avenue of communication that these things can bring us through? So I think that's one of the biggest problems that I see in sort of modern supernatural / paranormal, and I'm using those terms interchangeably. I know some people don't, but that's a problem that I see in these sort of discussions today, is that people are very concerned with, forgive me for saying this, but people are very concerned with true and false. They're very concerned with was it external or was it internal? And I'm like, I think that these boundaries are much more fluid than we give it credit for. I mean, good example of that, you mentioned synchronicities. You'll hear these synchronicities that people say, and unless it happened to you, they're a lot of times it's kind of like, I don't really care about your synchronicity. You know what I mean? Like, some of them are amazing, but it's kind of like dreams, right?
Yeah.
Dreams seem tailor-made to the individual, and you can have a completely profound dream that just doesn't resonate or have any special meaning for me. I think both of those things can be true, So like you see a butterfly and it's a butterfly, but it could also be, a message from a dead relative or something. And similar on that. Yeah, sir, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that goes into a couple. So my brain just went 18 different directions at the same time too, right? Because I know this is my world and quote unquote reality, right? But I don't necessarily feel I fit into that love and lighter, because just even the term makes me, I always call it stink eye tight butt. I just get that, oh man, like I don't fit necessarily in that, but there is a level of needing to take accountability and co-creating our experience. We are in co-creation with something that is creating our experience. And the other thought I had while you were talking was, maybe there is, that spirit on the other side having their own trippy experience, poking through into our world, checking you out while you're talking to the tree.
Yeah, I love this idea that I don't even think I was the first person to come up with it, but I've sort of taken it and embraced it a little bit here and there. That whenever you see, because you read these stories of people encountering humanoids of all different types, and often, not always, but often they look just as surprised to see us as we do to see them. Mm-hmm. It's a recurring theme that you see time and time again. And I'm like, what if there aren't some, elves in a dorm room in another dimension smoking their version of DMT?
Like the movie The Others?
Yeah, it's kind of like that. It very much, spoilers, I guess, for the others, but it kind of like is that, it's sort of turning the tables on who is the percipient and who is the perceived. And I think that's a really interesting idea. And honestly, like the whole I'm kind of glad that you brought it up, this altered states of consciousness angle, because that was what really unmoored my rigid thinking about the UFO question.
That was the question I had for you. Like, in your research, how have you changed your thinking?
So my problem with the whole, UFO thing and alien abduction thing when I was younger was that I was viewing it through that strictly materialist interpretation of, extraterrestrials in craft coming here. And it was I was a little bit of a contradiction myself, because on the one hand I said, okay, you look at the UFO literature and they're like, hundreds of thousands of different craft designs, no two are really alike, more or less. And 7 dozen different species of aliens coming here. I'm like, I really can't get past that. That's a little bit too elaborate for my tastes. That I can, but like, if you look at the literature, there's tons of different things. So that was part of my hesitancy to embrace the UFO question. The other part was that, quite frankly, I was terrified of alien abductions. It was like my primary fear. Like,
my niece is that way. You talk about, she literally cries if there's a news thing that comes up. She literally starts to have a panic attack just thinking about it.
I was almost that bad. I mean, like, a 25-year-old you know, supposedly grown man, you know, having these paranoid moments where I'd hear my phone low battery chirp and I'd think it was, you know, an alien getting ready to invade my bedroom. But then I discovered, you know, the discussions that were happening around altered states of consciousness and the idea that we might be perceiving these things through another reality, or that they might be, you know, just not part of this shared consensus experience that we had. And then that sort of like, that was a real light bulb moment for me, because, okay, well, that explains why they can look like so many different things, is because, you know, if they're somehow interacting with our imagination, then they can look like whatever they darn well please. But that also sort of broke that spell that the alien abduction scenario had on me, because if consciousness plays a role, then there is an implied certain sense of sovereignty that you have to the experience. It doesn't guarantee that you'll make it out in one piece, but it does imply that you have a degree of power in that particular encounter. So that was sort of what really opened up the field of ufology to me in a big way. And you know, it's this idea of these things sort of threading that boundary between the physical and the non-physical, and perhaps the physical and the, dare I say, spiritual, is not as popular. I've seen it sort of rise in popularity, and now with all these sort of hearings that we're having, it's sort of diminishing in popularity a little bit. But I think you'd be surprised how many people still are fully aware of the fact that if we're dealing with aliens, they're really, 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 really weird aliens. You know, aliens that are able to manifest synchronicities, and aliens that, you know, after you encounter them or see a UFO, you'll have poltergeist activity pop off in your home, or maybe you'll be taken aboard the craft and you'll meet your dead grandmother. Like, there's something metaphysical and not just physical about the abduction experience, which is, again, part of the reason why I find the comparisons to the fairy folklore so alluring, because like all of that's baked into that body of folklore from the very beginning, you know.
We just had this comment that I wanted to share with you. Michelle is saying the irony of why I lock my doors at night. It'll keep the grays out.
Yeah, you know, just I like to think that's the case, but I hate to tell you, Michelle, I've heard plenty of stories of people locking themselves up tight and not doing a darn thing. You know, the burglar alarm on, yeah, you know, the home security system on and everything. But you know, at the same time, here's the reassuring bit. You know, there was a late researcher by the name of Anne Druffel, and she collected, and actually a lovely little handbook that she wrote called I believe it's called How to Prevent Alien Abduction. And there are certain like techniques that she has, including things like,
tell me what
prayer,
that was
it's either how to prevent, I believe it's called How to Prevent Alien Abduction. Anne Druffel, Druffel.
Thank you.
And it's a wonderful book, because it takes a look at that angle of, again, the I can't use the word again, the sovereignty of one's consciousness and the role that seems to play in these abductions, and how people have, you know, yeah, they've physically lashed out, but just as often it seems successful to sort of stop these things through sheer will, and stop these things through prayer. And interestingly enough, as far as the prayer angle goes, you know, you'll have the evangelical crowd tell you that, you know, you need to be praying to Christ or Jesus or, you know, God or something like that. And that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems that prayer to anything can sort of act as a barrier. And I think that might imply some really interesting things about, you know, God itself. But, you know, yeah.
Again, that's a whole other big conversation, right? Like for the amount, when I first started doing what I'm doing, you know, full time, I was working 6 days a week, doing 7-8 sessions a day for a very long time. And so accumulate that over 16 years. I don't work like that now, but you know, I've never had, if I'm connecting with spirit, somebody that is on the other side, I've never had anybody show me a heaven space or a God.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you've never had anybody show you a heaven space or a God?
Their heaven space, but isn't, you know, what that is sort of presented to us through media, or you know, it's a very different. It's what brings that person a particular joy, that they're showing me, which always comes back to my thought about that co-creating.
Yeah, it's really kind of funny, because if you really start to dig into if you're approaching it from the Christian angle, which is kind of the default, in America, it's interesting that you don't really see a lot of descriptions of the mechanism of transition to the afterlife, nor really descriptions of the afterlife itself. You see what we've come to kind of accept about heaven. A lot of that comes from a lot of these early church figures and literary figures. Quite frankly, it's like early church fan fiction, and like we basically we end up basing a lot of our conceptions on that. And obviously other faiths are quite a bit more descriptive than the Christian Bible is. But I always find that interesting how it's almost like we have this idea of heaven that is almost pop culture generated for a lot of people, and again, in America, speaking as an American, it seems to be that way. But yeah, I think it's interesting, and so it would be really easy for somebody listening to me right now to think that I'm trying to cram the supernatural into this like dualistic, angels, demons, heaven, hell kind of model. And that's not what I'm trying to say. I do think it's mostly spirit based, but I sort of reject that dualistic sort of interpretation and prefer to look at something that's more along the lines of, like the book is called, An Ecology of Souls. There are good things and there are bad things, and there are things in between that, depending on the circumstances, can act either in your interest or not.
Yeah, it's I keep wanting to, if it's okay, coming back to the abduction of children in the night and changelings. If we could come around to that, if you could talk about that for.
No, absolutely. So, I've for some reason I've gravitated towards this fairy thing, and it's interesting because we associate fairies with England, Ireland, Scotland, and that's kind of where a lot of people stop. Maybe if they're thinking a little bit more, they'll think about German dwarves, or they'll think about Scandinavian elves and things like that. But we don't normally realize that, like, sort of the broader or bigger pop culture perspective, that just about every indigenous people has had a belief in these beings that tend to, not as a general rule, but tend to be smaller, tend to have an association with the dead, tend to live underground, and tend to enjoy taking people. So I was really interested in that, and again, taking up that banner of like, okay, well, how does this fairy stuff reflect itself in the UFO lore? The topic of child abduction naturally sprung to mind, and in a lot of ways I was quite hesitant to embark on that project because the subject matter is so dark. And I don't normally like to write depressing things for people. So trying to find a positive angle on that was a little bit difficult, but it is really interesting when you look at these older motifs of fairies abducting children and these modern stories of UFO contact. I mean, just again, the similarities become so specific that it becomes difficult to not see our modern UFO mythology. I say that with all the love in my heart. Mythology, I still think mythologies can be very true. The modern UFO mythology is somehow picking up a lot of these pieces or a lot of these trails that we left off when we abandoned so-called non-rational thinking, right? And one of those aspects, of course, is the child abduction angle. In fairy folklore, it was very common, and you'll see this amongst wild men and witches, even in some Native American tribes amongst lake monsters. But it's most famous for being a hallmark of the fairies, where they would take a child and substitute it with something else. Now, the exact identity of that something else would vary from story to story. Sometimes it would be a sickly fairy infant. Sometimes it would be an elderly fairy, or sometimes it would be, an effigy of some sort that has been cloaked with their glamour to appear like an animate child or something. And, despite this identity, typically in these stories, the changeling would have one of two resolutions. Either it would be exchanged back, and there were a lot of different folk remedies, a lot of them quite harsh, for getting your child back and getting the changeling sent back to fairyland, or the changeling would die. I always like to make it a point to emphasize the fact that in some cases, these changeling stories were an attempt to reconcile developmental disabilities and infanticide and that sort of
Yeah.
complex thing. Um, that's all. That's I would argue that's provably the case in some instances. There are some instances where there are court cases surrounding people who killed killed infants because they were suspected of being changelings. Having said that, some of the behaviors of these changelings do not seem to conform to developmental disabilities. You have changelings that stand up from the crib and speak full sentences, or run around the rafters of the house playing the pipes or something. And sounds like it's a little bit different than that. But the motivations behind the changeling thing are where you sort of start to see the vestiges of the modern UFO topic creep in. It depends sort of on what the target was and the arrangement was. There was this idea that if the fairies brought an elderly fairy to live in the place of a human infant, that it was almost sort of like a hospice arrangement of sorts, sort of to allow the elderly fairy to spend its last days looking like a human infant. In the case that it was a fairy infant that was exchanged, there was this belief that fairy milk was a sham. It didn't exist, much like their food. It was, glamored. It was, in essence, nothing. So that fairies could actually get the best nutrition from human mothers. But there's also a recurring theme that the fairies, in some sense, were a dying race, and that they needed more or less new blood, new life, new vigor to be sort of injected into their society every now and then in the form of human beings. And that puts us, not only in the mindset of, the afterlife to a certain degree, but it's something that explicitly raises its head in a lot of these modern tellings of, the supposed human alien hybrid engineering program. It's oftentimes the aliens will say something to the effect of, our society progressed so far and we lost the ability to procreate, and now we're having to combine with human beings to ensure the survival of our species. So that's just one little way, but the more you keep on picking at it, the more you keep on finding these other similarities. I mean, a lot of attention in terms of children and fairies is focused on the changeling thing, and rightfully so. A lot of the stories are of that variety, but there are also stories of completely consensual relationships between human beings and fairies that ended up spawning human fairy hybrids. And in these cases, the human fairy hybrids would oftentimes be gifted in some sort of way. They would excel at the arts, for example, and they would be poets and musicians and the like. And we still have that today. We still have that exact same idea today. If you look at these stories of star children or indigo children, two sort of motifs that often have a connection to, the UFO subject. These are children who are often, deemed excellent at these exact same things that the fairy hybrids would have been sort of seen as having earlier. So it is interesting to see that it almost looks like a reinvention of these older ideas in a lot of ways.
And then it comes to is it physical and non-physical, interdimensional? I mean, you have people putting talcum powder out.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that talcum powder bit. Because that's my go-to, because I ended up writing a 2-book series with my good friend Timothy Renner on just strange Bigfoot stories, like the Bigfoot stories that challenge the commonly held idea that it's just another big monkey that we'll discover someday.
Right. I had a guest on named Thomas Seawood. He's from
Yeah.
So more like that flesh and blood. And I grew up in Northern Ontario, so immersed in First Nation communities in Northern Ontario, and it's a flesh and blood that it was a tribe that they're long time ago that they interacted with, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting. You find some tribes will tend to say it's spirit. Some tribes will say it's physical. Some tribes will say it's physical with sort of spirit-like attributes. And I kind of, the older I've gotten, the more I've sort of decided that it is, again, something of a false dichotomy that I think we're facing, because, some people, again, coming back to you mentioning talcum powder, some people will say things like, well, Bigfoot's got to be an animal because ghosts don't leave footprints. And I'm like, oh, contraire. If you look at your parapsychological research,
Yes.
you'll find that one of the first ways of ghost hunting was to spread out talcum powder and to wait for footprints to manifest. So we're obviously at, a modern cultural level not getting something quite right about these distinctions between physical and non-physical. So yeah, I can't remember how we went down this this particular avenue, but oh no, it's with the hybrid thing. Yeah, I mean, I would think that if we were intended to take the human alien hybrid program literally, that we would have some way of verifying it by now. There would be some sort of genetic sequencing that would showcase anomalies in people who claim to be, hybrids. Which is why I tend to lean towards it being...
Isn't there research about that?
There is, and it's just it just doesn't quite meet the level of consistency for my own threshold of belief, and I understand why some people might. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the same with the Bigfoot stuff. Like there is DNA from Bigfoot, supposedly, and there's hair and whatnot, again, sort of challenging that physical non-physical aspect, but the DNA it always comes back anomalous, or similar to human and chimpanzee, and it always is it seems just out of reach of being a smoking gun. So if you look at the human alien hybrid sort of discussion, they're talking about things like the incidence of Rh negative blood, the increase of things like leukocytes or lymphocytes, and like there are certain markers that people claim that they've seen over the years, but none of them for me personally have really pushed it over the edge of like, oh, this is a material physical thing that is happening to people, which is why I tend to think that it's more of a sort of spiritual hybridization. And again, I know some people will probably sort of their toes will curl in their shoes when they hear that, but if you do look at some of the literature, and I go into this in a little bit in Ecology of Souls, if you look at some of the UFO literature, there are indications that people live with sort of this partial existence of being a human being and partial existence of being an extraterrestrial. There's an experiencer by the name of Susie Hansen who wrote an entire book on it called the dual soul connection, I believe. But there's this idea that you have these sort of like two forces living within you. And I find that more interesting and to a certain degree more plausible than the physical explanation, because it just has such strong antecedents in a lot of spiritual texts. I mean, this idea that we are solely, one body, one soul is kind of a relatively new idea that, I would say it's Judeo-Christian, but it seems to be mostly just Christian, because even in, ancient Judaism, there were discussions of there being different aspects of the soul. And the further back you go, the more you see things like, you can go all the way back to the Egyptian traditions where there were sometimes up to 9 different souls in the human body. And I think that it might be something like that we're seeing when we're talking about the human alien hybrid program. And I'm really quite fond of the idea of at least a what's the word? I'm trying to remember the word. Bipartite, a bipartite soul. Because like, how many times have you said like, well, my head wants to do this, but my heart wants to do this. And, it'll be such an easier way of conceptualizing it, as if there are these sort of different forces within us that are sort of have these sort of different agendas and different wants and needs at play. So, yeah, I'm kind of skeptical of like the literal reality of, well, sorry, not the literal reality. I'm skeptic of the physical reality of the human alien hybrid program, but I'm very much open to the idea that there's something soul-based going on. Again, like if you look at some of these changeling stories, there are instances in most of the changeling stories where the children are returned back to the human world. That return often goes unseen. It either happens overnight, or it happens behind a closed door, or it happens after they're left someplace. You don't normally see that actual moment of, the fairies coming back and taking their fairy child and giving back the human child. But there have been a couple of instances in some of these stories that are, not folk tales, but actually have some historical basis, of children who have been seen at that point of return, and there is no physical exchange. The child just sort of like their demeanor changes. And so it starts to look a little bit more like something like, possession. Starts to look a little bit more like possession. Yeah. And again, people will hear that and they'll go, demons. I'm like, I'm not saying demons. I'm just saying spirit. But yeah, it sort of does start to look like something like possession. Similarly, is especially in the cases of, adult changelings. Because we've talked about the child aspect, but adult human beings were oftentimes taken as well, especially women. It was the perceived most helpless people in the culture at the time. So human children and women. Those were the ones who are most vulnerable to changelings. And again, in these stories, there will be, the exchange will never be seen taking place, but you'll have the victim languishing in bed during an illness. And sometimes that person would die and they'd say, oh, well, we're burying the changeling. She is still away in fairyland with the fairies. And you could say, or you could look at it that her soul had somehow detached from her body during sickness, which is something that you hear in a lot of indigenous testimony. You hear it in a lot of the New Age stuff as well, that like whenever there's trauma or there's illness, your soul can actually sort of wander away from your body. So in this sense, the changeling thing sort of becomes a wandering soul idea. And I really wonder if viewing these things through soul and spirit isn't a little bit more, I'm not sure if it's more accurate, but I think it might be more consistent in terms of a view of these things. At least that's the way that I've found myself.
Yeah. I have people ask me about walk-ins. Yes, Michelle, actually, that just, as I'm saying walk-ins, Michelle commented walk-ins as well.
Yeah.
Too. And I've not had experience enough, to really talk about that. But that would go to, is there, that in that conversation or that thread that you're talking about, more than one spirit within.
It does. And it's really interesting because sometimes you'll see there's some really wild UFO stories that I've run across from like the 70s and whatnot, where people are imprisoned in another space. It's always assumed to be a spaceship, but there's nothing really spaceship-esque about it. It's like a room with a screen. And through the screen, they're seeing the eyes of their body as this other alien being has taken over their body and is doing things. And I'm thinking to myself, is this sort of a metaphor for something else inhabiting your body, and that you're being sort of forced to watch as it happens and watch as it unfolds? I do think that is sort of consistent with some of the themes that we've talked about. And there's this underlying sense that a lot of this has to do with soulcraft. I mean, in alien abduction after alien abduction after alien abduction, these things, whatever they are not Arthur C. Clarke-esque emissaries of atheism. They're very much preoccupied with the human soul and the big questions of God and creation and things like that. So it does seem like the soul is very much at issue in these stories, and that, of course, ties in nicely with some later interpretations of the fairy folk sort of being stewards of creation. That's kind of a reworked version of the Swiss alchemist Paracelsus, and it's kind of a theosophic idea from that, spiritual movement at the late 19th century. But, there is an indication that the fairies sometimes are the agents responsible for growth. And in that sense, perhaps they're, the agents responsible for reincarnation. There are stories.
Rebirth, right?
Well, yeah, so it's really interesting. There's sort of this inversion of fairyland that you'll find where it was sometimes said that fairies would laugh at funerals and cry at births. So it's this idea of this revolving door between our world and theirs, which again would sort of make sense that we're discussing matters of the soul rather than matters of the physical. And again, I'm not saying that you can't see a fairy and there aren't little footprints left in the ground afterwards. And I'm not saying that you can't be taken aboard an alien spacecraft and come back with scoop marks in your hands, because those things happen. But if you look at traditions like dream injuries, which are a thing where people will actually have the injuries from their dreams manifested on their bodies, or you look at things like, stigmata and those traditions, there does seem to be, again, it's a thing we keep on coming back to in this discussion. I'm not intending for this to happen, but it's this false boundary that we've set up between the mental and the physical, or the physical and non-physical. It seems to be more of an interaction there than we realize.
I think too, and if we were talking about co-creating and then it comes back to accountability as well too, right? And if we are co-creating and understanding in our language and what we're taking in and what we allow ourselves to experience and be open-minded to, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like the psychedelic thing, right? It's about set and setting. People who don't go into a trip with a good attitude or don't go in under the right, proper, peaceful circumstances, their environment around them is, a little bit chaotic. They might have a bad trip. And I kind of wonder if something is not at play in distinguishing between these positive encounters and these negative encounters, because everything, UFOs, fairies, ghosts, cryptids to a certain degree, you'll hear these encounters that are, again, all love and light. And then you'll hear these encounters that are just like this existential terror.
Right.
And those very much sound like good trips and bad trips to me, which makes me think that we are sort of accessing, you can call it a dimension if you'd like. I prefer to use older terms like the other world or, or the spirit realm, but we're accessing this other reality. And a lot of, we are bringing some sort of baggage to these experiences when they happen.
Yeah. I agree. And is it baggage over different lifetimes?
Yeah, I always find that really interesting because that's another thing that the crowd of researchers who are really invested in the extraterrestrial idea surrounding UFOs don't really like to acknowledge, but there are so many reincarnation stories associated with alien abductions, UFO experiencers, etc. And if you look at the literature surrounding reincarnation itself, I mean, it's pretty strong. The work of Jim Tucker and Ian Stevenson from the University of Virginia. It's hard to say whether or not this is reincarnation, because maybe there are other mechanisms by which we can access the memories of people who have passed on, but I'll be darned if it doesn't look a lot like reincarnation, And over time you hear these sort of, I'll call them low resolution criticisms of the idea of reincarnation. It's something like, well, if reincarnation's real, then why are there so many people on the planet, more people than ever before? And it's like, but you're assuming a one-to-one comparison here. And like, to me, that's like asking how many waves can be on the ocean, right? Like there could be no waves or there can be an infinite amount of waves. It's all about like how many little concrescences, how many little manifestations of life energy can pop up. And, there's, again, with the idea of our souls being made up of different things, a single wave isn't made up of, a different wave, but it might be made up of parts of that wave. Like the molecules in that wave might have been in another wave in another sense. So,
and it's asking people to stay open-minded, like
right.
come at it with skepticism, and you should be, but then deep dive into different resources and research and allow yourself to experience different opinions so that you can come to a different conclusion as well too.
I completely agree. My mentor Greg Bishop calls it the certainty fetish. Like everybody has this like strong desire to be absolutely certain, this compulsion, I guess, to be absolutely certain. And there are very few hills that I will die upon in this subject matter. Like if you really had to push me, it's going to be things like psi phenomena and near-death experiences and reincarnation. Like those are the things that I think have the best like evidence as presented by the parameters that we generally accept evidence, especially psi phenomena. I mean, some of these laboratory experiments conducted by folks like Daryl Bim and Dean Radin and Rupert Sheldrake are just really, really well constructed and well put together, no matter what detractors say. So like there are very few things that I'm going to stand by and say, this is a thing. Like whether you like it or don't like it or believe in it or don't believe it, this is a thing. I have a much bigger space inside my head that I call the interesting if true basket, where it's like, I'll see this and be like, oh, that's interesting if true, or, it all comes down to, how much you believe the witness and how much you how much you think that their interpretation of what they were experiencing is accurate. If it's, even if it was strange, is their interpretation exactly what was going on? I just have a big basket of interesting, if true. And again, that idea of just remaining open to different things.
Yeah.
I would like to think that even if I had a UFO land outside my window right now, the most certain thing that I could say was something strange happened to me, and it looked like this, but I don't know if it was really that,
Right.
Yeah.
And even though I'm in this world, right, of I get shoved into the love and lighter category, right, even though it's uncomfortable for me, I still look at things from a left brain perspective before I say it's this. Like, the lights are flickering, so let's call an electrician. My son's an apprentice, so thank goodness for that. Let's change the light bulb and let's do these things first before we, say that it is, grandma showing up to let us know she's in the room. Like, they're having questioning is okay.
It is amazing to me how the people who aren't into this stuff view the people who are into this stuff. And what I mean by that is, I have met so many people who are like you, and I would count myself one of them. Like, let's eliminate the prosaic explanation before we jump to the fantastic. And, we're not all a bunch of loons who are saying that every, creak in our house is a ghost or something. Like, but that's the way that we're portrayed, unfortunately. But like, when you rule out all those things, in that very Sherlock Holmesian way, then, the impossible seems the most likely. Yeah.
My basket is labeled paranormal, explainable, what the F.
Yeah. Good. I like that. Those are good. Those are good baskets to have. It might be time to do some house cleaning in my brain and assign some new basket labels.
Yeah, that's kind of how I put it. If you are just joining us now, thank you for joining us here on Spirit Switchboard. I'm Carrie Lynn Shellhorn, your host, and we have Joshua Cutchin on today. And you are listening to us live on 105.3 and 107.7 New Orleans. Where did I want to go? There's so many places. I honestly had about 6 pages of notes, and I just had all of this stuff highlighted. Like, it was, my daughter said, your ADHD is hanging out. You should roll it back in, Mom. Because I was talking to her about it today. But I was thinking too, like, when in this conversation that I've had with my daughter, I said, when she's not immersed in school, and she's not around those people in academia, I said, do you find it difficult, and do you miss that sort of conversation? So for you, the same, sort of question that I have, if you're, listening to conversations or watching the media or television shows and movies and seeing how things are portrayed, you have a different viewpoint of it. How do you?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. My parents, I adore them. They're great parents, but sometimes they'll tape or record, an episode of some sort of paranormal TV thing, and I'm like, I really just don't want to see it because like, when you really dig into these things, there's so much nuance that I feel like gets left out, both supporting the idea that these things are paranormal and both supporting the idea that these things are rational. And there's symbolism, and there's all these different ways of explaining it, even if it is anomalous, that I kind of have trouble with. Fiction, I think, gets a little bit of a different pass for me, because I realize that there are some constraints that you have to sort of break when you're dealing with telling a story. But yeah, it can be frustrating sometimes, for sure. I will say that I think that the community of researchers, and that, looking again to the UFO question, that sort of very 1970s, let's go out and measure burn marks in the ground kind of mindset. I think that there are a lot of researchers who vastly underestimate the sort of paranormal / supernatural renaissance that we are in, and how it has been spurred on by podcasting and by conversations like this one and by radio programs. I mean, yeah, to a certain degree, it's that coast to coast AM Art Bell legacy, but also just I think that podcasting and what's the word I'm looking for? Alternate media discussing these things has done so much to keep the conversation alive and has provided a platform to sort of get into these intricacies that you're not going to get on a 30-minute or hour-long even paranormal program. It allows you to stretch your arms a little bit and settle back
and ask more questions.
And ask more questions. Yeah. So I know that there are some people, in some of my work, I will cite podcasts, and there are some people with a more academic background than me. Which, having 2 master's degrees, that's kind of weird that other people have more of an academic background than me, but I guess so. There are people who will say, well, you cited a podcast. I'm like, yeah, I cited a podcast because, there's something about appearing on a show and telling a story in your own voice. And there's a certain vulnerability, that comes when experiencers share these things in this firsthand, raw, audio-based format that I think deserves recognition. And, I just have the most love in the world for paranormal podcasters and supernatural podcasters because they're just grinding away at this every week. And really, I think they've done so much to further the conversation around these topics.
And presenting it in not just one fixed viewpoint, right? And allowing all these different viewpoints to.
Right, absolutely.
And that was actually, I think, something, it was something that I had highlighted in you doing this research with no fixed agenda, no fixed, thought about what that end outcome was going to be. And it's just like, I had this thought and I ran with this. And this is what I discovered in it. And here you go.
Yeah, it's kind of a no-no in political circles, and even in terms of the way that we do or don't forgive people nowadays. Like we assume that like you have to say something years ago and that's the way that you feel or that's the way that you think. And I think we just need to give everybody a lot more credit for evolving the way that they think and sort of coming to different conclusions and coming to different emotions and stuff. And I mean, that's been the case for me. My personal outlook on what these things are and aren't has changed over the years. And there's a certain consistency in it just by merit of the fact that I keep on coming back to that UFO question. I'm like, I still don't think it's aliens. But at the same time, like as far as what it is, I'm still not sure. I thought some things a couple of years ago that I just don't think now. And, I have my certain pet ideas and certain things that I want to be true. But as far as what it is, I'm going to kind of have to remain sort of agnostic. The closest that I've come to sort of saying this is what it is Ecology of Souls. But not because I think that's what it is. It's because it's a model of it's a holistic model of these phenomena in a way that makes sense for me. So that, in other words, what I'm saying is that like I can make sense of things that I couldn't make sense of before through this particular model, and it just helps me feel a little bit more comfortable, because a big like a big part of Ecology of Souls was me looking at these reincarnation stories and alien abductions, and me looking at these,
and where your fear was.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah. That's also true. But these stories of like pre-birth memories and alien abductions, like, that's really far out in the love and light stuff, But the stories aren't going away, They're still there, and you've got to do something with that. And I don't think it's healthy to just say, well, these people are crazy. Not these people who have seen UFOs, but these people who say they had a pre-birth memory aboard a UFO. They're the crazy ones. It's like, look, we all live in glass houses when we're looking at what the general population thinks. Like, we're all, quote unquote, the crazies in this. So I don't think it really does anybody any good to sort of separate into these different factions and say, well, the ghost people are crazy, but the Bigfoot people have it going on. Like, I think there's a little bit of truth in everything, and it's up to each of us to sort of find a way to figure out what the heck it means. And even if it's just a metaphor, okay, well, the UFO stuff is real, but the pre-birth memory stuff is just a metaphor. Again, that's not where I wound up, but I'm saying even if you view stuff like that as just a metaphor, you can still learn from something about that, So I'd like to think that I sort of have a flexible and and non-calcified viewpoint on these sort of things, because when thinking gets brittle, it breaks. Belief is the enemy, as John Keel said.
Right. Well, in my deep dive that I was doing over this last week, an Ecology of the Souls, I was trying to get in it, and I'm a ferocious reader, but there was just no way I could get through those three volumes before today. But it was fascinating, which triggered. I'm a question person. Like I ask a lot of questions, and what about this, and how come this, and why this, and go searching for different viewpoints, right? And it led me to Mike Cleland. So I got triggered here, found Mike Cleland, actually did an email exchange with him, and I need to reach it back out to him next week. And then that stemmed texting my siblings going, do you remember the owls?
Yeah, I see your owl behind you. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the one behind me. But I mean, as kids, we had some strange things happen. And so, some things in your book triggered this. And I appreciate how your brain works, and I appreciate how you serve that to us. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate your appreciation. And yeah, Mike's stuff is some of the most important. If I had a top 10 list of most important UFO books, it would definitely be The Messengers would definitely be on there, because it's just, he picked up a thread that's come along that no one has really explored. And that's what I've tried to do with a lot of my stuff too, is
I agree.
People will mention a recurring theme in passing in like a sentence, or maybe if they're generous, a paragraph, but they don't really pull it apart and see like what it is about it. So, a good example of that was my second book, in 2016, The Brimstone Deceit, which was looking at the different types of smells that are reported in paranormal encounters. Because, you'll read people say in passing in these old UFO books, like, people have noticed the smell of ozone and, and sulfur. And it's like, okay, well, you're not going to do anything with that? Like, do something with that. Like, what does that mean? And then, you're reading the parapsychology books, and they're like, yeah, demonic possessions often have a scent of hydrogen sulfide. And you're like, okay, well, can somebody like put these two isolated bits of scholarship in dialogue with each other and see what comes out? And, I have some misgivings about
is that your path and purpose? Nobody else picks it up, and is it because that's your role?
I guess so. I guess so. I have a couple ideas for sort of going back down that path, because I've strayed for it and the ideas have gotten bigger and bigger. But I would really like to sort of return to that, like taking a look at this thing that people just say and take for granted. And, I think maybe we can learn something about these phenomena if we really drill down a little bit on,
Yeah. Well, the conversations just kept going. It was like my phone was blowing up.
That's great, though. That's great.
And my brother, who I hear like on holidays from, because he's just a busy guy.
Right.
He was like even blowing up my phone, because we collectively had different experiences. And we're putting all of those layers of personal experiences together into this one collective, right?
Yeah, and that's something that I wish, there's so much clamoring for, capital T truth. And we sort of talked about this a little bit earlier about, the sort of emphasis on truth. But like, there's so much clamoring for truth, especially regarding the UFO question nowadays. And I feel like that's kind of missing the point, because so many of these experiences are so personal.
And that was my question to my siblings, because it definitely, our experiences surround some kind of UFO experience, and whatever that really is, we sort of unfolding it. And but we had such a dysfunctional home. Like, where does our emotional intelligence, our experience, our subconscious, that's where I go in my head when I'm questioning. And I'm the person that talks to dead people for a living. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
It's like I'm asking all these left brain questions because I need to try to understand it from a left brain perspective first before I can go to this place. So
right.
Yeah.
Right. Because, you need to do a service to people and tell them as close as you can get to an objective read on what's going on.
Yeah.
And if the objective read is, no, your house isn't haunted, your pipes really are in need of some plumbing attention, then you're still helping them out.
But I still find deep diving, you can't find all the answers, because we're always going to have more questions. Like, I think will we ever really know all of the answers?
Right. Well, and again, it's kind of a problem too, because like people will say, oh, this aspect of a case or this aspect of someone's story has been quote unquote solved as being mundane. It's like, okay, but multiple things could be happening at one time. They could have rodents in the attic and things flying off the shelves. Like those things are not, mutually exclusive.
Yes. Because I certainly have been into homes where somebody has cleaned it energetically, and I've stepped in going, whoa, there's some stuff happening here. So again, is it alternate realities layered over top of each other, each of us experiencing from a different space? Like there's lots to it.
Well, you were talking about like ways that my thinking has changed, and an idea that until very recently I was extremely opposed to was the idea that these things could somehow be self-generated. And people will hear that and they'll think that I'm saying it's all in their head, or they'll think that I'm saying people are deceiving themselves. That's not what I mean. I mean, I think that we as individual human beings are so much more powerful than we give ourselves credit for. And I think that it's entirely possible that some of these things that we're projecting, that look like exterior intelligences might be coming from a part of us. Again, if you look at that idea of like the polypsychic soul that we were talking about earlier, your soul having multiple parts or multiple, separate entities within yourself, like that was something that you saw in those traditions all the time, that you could actually see a part of yourself exteriorized. That's partially where the doppelganger idea comes from. So I was very hesitant towards that, because my inner 13-year-old wants there to be a Bigfoot and an alien like out there.
Me too.
But at the same time, I have to say, like, it could be a part of that. And it's still no less miraculous to me if we are that powerful in sort of changing our own realities. I think that's still an amazing thing to consider.
And I if it's challenging a belief, not even necessarily a belief, because I wouldn't say that I hang on really tightly to any particular belief. I'm very much, tell me more about it.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me more about, your experience, or the, where the information is coming from. And that's, I think when I found your book, where I started originally and why I contacted you, right? Like, I just appreciated it. And then it moved to, very folklore in the movies, and, how all of those different scholars approached that project, right? And differently.
Yeah. I mean, that probably is why. I mean, you're saying that you enjoyed my work, so I hope this doesn't sound like an assumption, but like that probably is why you enjoyed it, because I try to confront my biases and my beliefs as often as I can. Not just with these topics, but like religiously, politically, in terms of how I parent. Like, I try to say, is this the right way? Is this like, could you be wrong, about this? And so I think that's, in my rich fantasy life, that's the way everybody behaves, is they're always kind of questioning themselves. But I
mean, it's, I think for us, if it's okay for me to make that assumption, it's being okay to go past our comfort zone edge.
Right.
And not everyone is comfortable going past that edge.
Yeah, and I get that people have different reasons for whether or not they might be comfortable doing that too. That's something else to consider. But I've always felt that if I'm not sort of challenging myself, I'm not growing. And here I am sort of preaching about this, and I'm way behind on my exercising, but with every aspect besides my cardiovascular health, I tend to try to challenge myself. But yeah,
I'm an emotional eater, so that's where I go.
Well,
and I know that I don't challenge myself to do better. I mean, I go through waves of it, but that makes us human. That's still the human experience.
It does. And you sort of mentioned trying things different and sort of approaching things from different topics, or different angles. I mean, that was sort of the impetus for that book of essays that you alluded to, Fairy Films, which is just sort of looking at it looks at different films and the overt and covert ways that these fairy mythologies sort of manifest themselves. I had never been the curator / editor of a collection of essays before. It was a different experience that I wanted to try. I'm not sure if I'll ever do it again. It's a bit like herding cats. But this project sat on the shelf, completed for a while, and there were some behind the scenes difficulties, but it finally came out earlier this year. And it's a fun book, I think. It has the predictable things that you'd expect in a book on fairy films like Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, but it also, I think it throws some real curveballs. There's a friend of mine who wrote an essay on some Japanese horror films and how they sort of have.
That actually was one of the ones that I read first and shared with my oldest son, because that's his interest.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually, I had just chatted with my son. He lives in Calgary, Alberta. He's in a totally different province than me. And I talked to him yesterday morning about, hey, do you want to come on the show and do a segment with me about Japanese folklore?
Yeah. I mean,
and not necessarily that it's like coming from an educated background. It's just his passion. So, that he's similar to you, where his passions are, he retains every little detail. He could tell you the page and paragraph where he's got that kind of brain.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of so what I was trying to do with that book of essays, and you may or may not think I succeeded, but I just find it so interesting. The simplest version of this is that fairies are a punchline in the modern world, right? People will say, I believe in Bigfoot, I don't believe in leprechauns, and it's like, I understand that, but that body of fairy folklore, again, worldwide, so you can call it the Japanese yokai, you can call it the Cherokee Nunyanahi, you can call it, I believe it's called the Vizimba of Madagascar. That may or may not be the term. I'm trying to remember it off the top of my head. You can whatever this body of folklore surrounding this class of spirits is, we laugh about it, but it's so present still, and it seeps into our lives in ways that we don't appreciate. And the original thought surrounding the book was that maybe I'll just sort of do a book trying to illustrate that. So the idea that, like, the term stroke, the medical term stroke, comes from a belief in the fairy stroke, that the fairies would come up to you and touch you. Like that's where that term comes from. The color cobalt is from the cobalt dwarves that would be found in the German mines and stuff like that. There's so many things that we just carry with us that we don't really think about being attributable to fairy folklore, but it really is there. And similarly, there are I wouldn't say all like modern horror and science fiction, but so much of modern horror and science fiction really does draw upon those same ideas.
That was a question I had for you. Actually, is in my little pink highlighter. How does folklore? How can it inspire and influence fiction?
Yeah. Like, can you repeat that one more time?
How folklore, how it can inspire or influence fiction, and that's sort of where. Yeah, no,
that's and it's kind of weird because having completed this novel that's coming out on Monday officially,
and it's called.
It's called Them Old Ways Never Died. If you've been following along with our conversation, you can probably guess what the antagonists are in the book. But it's kind of a hodgepodge of a lot of my different ideas, and I try to make it as faithful to the folklore and a lot of paranormal thinking as I could. So it's I can safely say that it's one of the more it's one of the more faithful to those aspects in terms of fiction that I've seen. That's kind of what I wanted to do, is create something that I wanted to read, right? But having gotten to this point, having released a novel, I'm looking back over my last couple of projects, Ecology of Souls notwithstanding, and they've tended to shift towards this fictional idea. So there's obviously the novel, which is fiction. There's the collection of fairy films, essays, which are centered around cinema. I also released an essay through Dr. Jack Hunter in his collection of essays on high strangeness called Deep Weird. And that was looking at how we might learn something from these encounters that are especially strange in the paranormal. That's what the term high strangeness refers to. If we look at how they compare to filmmaking techniques. And the idea is not that, not that aliens are necessarily using filmmaking techniques, but certain filmmaking techniques, camera shots, storytelling modalities, etc., elicit certain reactions in audiences. So when those same sort of things appear in these high strangeness encounters, is that perhaps not also to elicit a reaction in the witness? Was sort of my line of thinking. So looking back at this sort of thing that I'm doing, I find myself gravitating more towards fiction, and it's not because I'm trying to get away from the speculative nonfiction that we started talking about when we first began our conversation, but it's rather because I think that, again, the line between fiction and the truth in regards to this topic, I think, is much more permeable than we appreciate. If we are co-creating, if these things are somehow deriving their appearance or behavior from our expectations that are imparted to us culturally or, societally, then fiction plays a huge role in this, yeah.
Do you find fiction is still able to deliver new concept, whether it's a truth or your perceived truth, to adults in a different way that maybe is more manageable for them to move outside of their comfort zone?
Well, it's the same reason, that parables are useful, is because
that's where I was going to go. Children's books teach them,
Yeah, exactly.
Aesop's fables.
No, there really wasn't a tortoise and a hare in a race, but the point still stands. And so it's something that a big influence on me. Patrick Harper, who wrote this fantastic book called Demonic Reality, he said at one point, the gist of his statement was that fiction can be the most real thing that you've ever seen. And what he sort of meant by that was, you can watch, let's say, a play of two people falling into and then back out of love, and those people never existed. And, the emotions that you see on stage are kind of manufactured, but it can be like the most true depiction of what that's like, distilled of anything that you've ever seen. It can really get to the heart of the matter with a certain degree of power and clarity that you would have to live a lifetime to understand otherwise. And I think that's something that's really powerful in fiction.
But it evokes that emotion,
right?
That within the reader, and then they start, because we always seek out relatability, and how that comes to them, right? And
I think that maybe you might be getting onto something that's even more important here, is the centrality of emotion and impact on the experiencer's lives being at being as the most important thing in these experiences. I guess sort of what I'm getting at is one of my biggest irritations about people who don't take these topics seriously is that they make fun of experiencers. And yes, there are hoaxers, and yes, there are liars, but let's say we can rule out those things. Then, you might be making fun of someone who really did come across a werewolf, that's not cool. Don't make fun of the person because they've been affected by that. Or you're making fun of someone with mental illness. Mm-hmm. Or you're making fun of someone who mistook something for something strange. But in every case, the trauma that they've experienced is still real. Like, we're not measuring the degree of trauma. So it's kind of looks gross for the people who are really skeptical of these things. Not saying that you have to take every account on face value, but, just try to have a little bit more compassion. Is that so much to ask?
It will shut down people from sharing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, we're missing out on these opportunities to add to the collective, right? If we don't have everyone's story because they're scared to come forward.
No, absolutely. I completely agree with that. And, you know, in as critical as I can be of the modern of this year's, you know, United States congressional hearings regarding, you know, UAP and UFOs and the sort of thing, I think at the very least it is having a thawing effect on some of these discussions, because people have experienced things that they haven't been able to integrate, and they haven't been able to come forward and be honest about. And, you know, that's a confronting thing to have to deal with. So I do think there's some benefit to that. But, you know, I do think that fiction can kind of have a therapeutic role in that as well. Again, like, that's part of the reason that we listen to sad songs, right? Is to know that that other people have experienced the things that we're going through. So, yeah, I guess that's sort of why I ended up gravitating towards fiction in the past year and a half. You know, I also wanted to experience this thing that I've had a lot of friends who have written fiction have told me about, and I wanted to experience it myself because it kind of sounds low-key paranormal in and of itself. It's where the character will approach you and tell you what they can and can't do, or like you try to write a character into a situation and like, nah, I'm not doing that. And, you know, I'll be darned. It did happen a couple of times. I had one substantial rewrite of a chapter, and I remember rewriting it and sort of rearranging some of the information in it, some of the discussion in it. And it wasn't the feeling that I got it wrong the first time. It was the feeling that the transmission came through incorrectly or garbled. You know, if that makes any sense.
Totally makes sense.
Yeah. And so I think that it's a recurring theme, and I guess I should stop saying it at this point, but I think that we need to have a greater appreciation for the actual reality and life that these sort of worlds take on, even if they are imaginary. And I would push forward and say they're not imaginary, they're imaginal. So they might be from your head, but they're not in your head. Yeah,
exactly. And I tell people, you know, when I am listening to them share their experience, or when I'm trying to teach, when I'm teaching people about letting go, and it's always at a non-thinking moment where those plops are going to come in seemingly out of nowhere, right? It's in a non-thinking moment. All of a sudden this sentence shows up, or, you know, it's the solution that you're looking for. It's in a non-thinking moment that it shows up.
Well, it's probably why we've over the millennia have ascribed such power to dreams, is because, you know, we're thinking, but we've let Jesus take the wheel, to use the metaphor, you know, not literally that, but like we've just sort of, you know, taken our hands off of, we're not controlling the situation anymore. We're sort of letting ourselves be controlled in a way.
I personally don't want to dream.
You don't want. You don't want to.
Well, I want to be so deeply asleep that I wake the neighbors up snoring. That's how deep I want to sleep.
See, you need to have some of my dreams, because I have these people who have these profound, like super realistic dreams, and I'm like, I very rarely get those. I get like, you know, a guy who has a salmon for a head talking to me about how it's raining upside down or something. Like, it's never anything that has that sort of weight to it, or rare.
Yeah, I don't want to have a dream where I need to hyper focus and try to understand what the whole bigger meaning to that is. I think too, because I spend so much of my days, from how I articulate it, in the other world.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm kind of in that space where I don't want to be there on my own time. I just want to go to sleep at the end of the day.
No, I can totally understand that. You're like, I've been in dreamland all day. The last thing I want to do when I go to sleep is go to dreamland.
And it's such a funny term, like, to say, is it dreamland, the other world, this alternate reality? And you know, I was thinking about an experience that I've had it happen 3 times. You know, when we're talking about possession or changelings and this coming in and out, and, you know, trance channeling, when you're stepping over here and they're stepping in, whoever that is, right? But I know that my face shape changed, my voice changed, mannerisms changed, and me was here observing whatever this was till they were done and out, and everybody in the room was like wanting more of it, and I just wanted to go to my car and cry and go home. I was done. Like I don't know what that just was, but
no,
I'm not cool with whatever that was.
No, that sounds about right from what I've heard. Yeah. I mean, and so so here's the flip side of all this is that, you know, and you probably you kind of want to not step away, but like you kind of want to break every now and then. And I, on the other hand, am just I hesitate to say that I'm dead as a doornail regarding these topics, because I've had a couple things happen that have been strange here and there. But I tell you what, when I go out looking for it, that's like kryptonite. Like nothing's going to happen if I go out to look for something. It really has started to feel that way. And so like I'm trying to rationalize, I'm like, maybe I've just got a really good guardian angel or higher self who's like, Josh, stop going looking for this stuff. It's work every they're just really good at it.
I think you try too hard that you miss, because it's always subtle. And to me, you know, that was something that you know, I really resonated with in going down that fairy folklore, which, you know, there's a subtlety to it. Those realms and how they're overlaying each other are subtle. And
yes,
you know,
that makes sense. No,
so when you breathe and relax and just be totally, it's gonna, you know, and you being a creative person in music, that's channeling. When you are creating, you are channeling.
I will say that, you know, so I made a conscious shift, because I am classically trained, and I made a conscious shift away from that. You know, around the same time that, well, yeah, it's probably about 2008. So I guess it's been a lot longer than I want to admit now. Yeah. But that is something that I notice, is that like once you start getting off the page and you start doing things that are a little bit more improvisational, like even though, you know, as a tuba player, you don't get to improvise a whole lot. Nobody really wants to hear you do that a whole lot. If you're playing like walking bass lines and you just got like, you know, a series of chord changes and you've got to find the way to connect them and find different figures to do. There are things that you play and you look back on, or if, you know, you're fortunate enough to have a recording of, you listen to or watch again, and you're like, that was not me. Like, I don't know where that came from. Yeah. You know, it was for me, you know, it's somewhere here in my lips and it's somewhere here in my fingers, but like, I don't know. I was not in the driver's seat, you know, during that time frame. So again, I think it's all about, again, something that we talked about earlier, appreciating how subtle the strange can be and how often it might happen. So I just need to show a little bit more gratitude for that, I guess. I still would love to see something like Bigfoot, something that dramatic. You know, I've experienced plenty of ghost stuff. I've experienced plenty of ghost stuff that's like not a question in my mind. But
I want to see a Sasquatch too, so bad.
Yeah, and everybody says that until it's, you know, 11:30 at night and you're opening the blinds. You don't want to see a face right there. Then it's like, oh, maybe, you know, you want to see. No, what you want is you want to see a Sasquatch at like 1 PM, 100 yards away. That's what you want to see. You know? Yeah.
My dad, you know, lives on a reservation with my stepmom in Northern Ontario, and he had told me that, you know, there was people had reported, there's lots of those stories in Northern Ontario, but he said like right literally almost in his backyard someone had saw this huge bipedal dragging the hind quarter of a moose behind it.
Oh, geez.
So, like, how big would it be?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking. Yeah, any part of the moose.
Like, Dad, do you think somebody will take me out there? And he's like, Carrie Lynn, like, you want to die from some angry Sasquatch? Yeah. I'm like, it would be an epic death and hopefully recordable. Like,
it would be a really interesting way to go. You know, there's that moment every now and then when I have some sort of trivial illness that can go bad, like, you know, you get like a cut that's infected or something, and you're like, you know, 200 years ago this would have been a death sentence. That'll be a really embarrassing way for me to die. You know?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And I was thinking too about you doing tuba. Like, that's I thought that was brilliant. You know, when my son he went to school for audio engineering. He's now doing electrician, but he was very musically gifted. And when he was young, I made him do bass guitar, and he was kind of irritated because he wanted to be that one wailing out front, right? And I went, dude, but you know, when you get older, you do bass, you're always guaranteed a gig on the weekend because there's not really like, you know, that bass player is a hard spot to fit. So for you, where would those musical, like what music inspired you?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like that old adage. It could be the same could be said for bass guitar, I assume, as it could be said for tuba. It's easy to play but hard to play well. You know what I mean? So yeah,
holds everyone together.
Yeah, I mean, there is something. It can be a little bit panic-inducing when somebody calls a tune that you haven't heard of. But you know, I'm at the point now with playing all of the New Orleans style stuff that I can usually, I usually know my way around it. But yeah, sorry, you asked a question. I sort of went on a different tangent with that easy to play, hard to play well sort of thing. But yeah, it is kind of interesting to be in the driver's seat and you know, you're kind of, it's this interesting contradiction of always being featured but never being featured, you know, because you're just always going in the background. But
what a great place for you to be in, Josh, like this place of evolvement with music and writing and your family and this growth and evolvement that not very many people get to have, these experiences that of things that are a passion be their purpose and their job and a career, and it takes work. I'm not trying to
but you're absolutely
to get there, but that you're at this place of being recognized for it is amazing.
You're absolutely right, and I try to remind myself of that often. You know, I do some other freelance writing, but it's also on these topics. And some days I get up and I'm like, I've got to write, you know, all this today, and I don't really feel like it. But then I have to sort of stop and say, Josh, somebody's paying you to write about Atlantis. Like, just shut up, you know. Like, so you have to do a gut check. I'm kind of the philosophy that, you know, I could probably be on a beach sipping Mai Tais all day and find a way to complain about it, because that's just what we do as human beings. Like, you know, we find a way to complain. But yeah, I am incredibly grateful for the path that I've been on, and you know, I'm nothing. Well, not I am all. You know, we all have an intrinsic value, but like my work is nothing, I guess, without the support from people who have just been so incredibly kind and generous and enthusiastic, and it's great. It's just I'm blessed. It's the best way to put it.
It's our network changes, you know, as the more that we're stepping into doing there, and there's a flow and ease to it. Even, you know, though there's days where we lack motivation, like there's definitely days where I lie to myself about how many clients I have in the day in order to get through the day.
Yes, it's also true.
You know, like the sometimes the motivation's not there, but then again, like you're feeling the gratitude from the people who are on the receiving end of what you have to offer. So.
Yeah, and you know, there have been some times recently when I have been in need of friends, and they've just stepped up in such big, profound ways, and it's just been humbling, and it really is comforting when you have a network of people who know your heart, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And that, you know, it's almost like they sort of anticipate what you're going to do, and you know, people that you can really trust to advise you on things, and it's just it's beyond anything I could have ever hoped for. And you know, I'm not trying to I'm not trying to slam on musicians. I'm not. But I remember this conversation that I had with my co-author of the Bigfoot books, Timothy Renner, good friend of mine, who's also a musician and has been doing the band scene and stuff from time to time. We were driving back from a conference together, and I said, you know, Tim, I said, as a rule, the people that I meet in the paranormal are like consistently much nicer and giving with their time than the people who I meet who are musicians. And he's like, yeah, you're kind of right. You know, and I think part of that might stem from the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, we all do live in glass houses with this. Like we've all got some kind of wacky stories to share, and we're all we're all trying to figure it out, and I think that these communities tend to be very aware of that. And so in a lot of ways, every community has its infighting, but in a lot of ways, I think it can be a more understanding community than you'll get in a lot of other disciplines. And that's just, I have made some of the best friends and mentors that I've ever made and ever will make in these topics. And it's so near and dear to my heart. And these people are just, they're family.
Right. Where can people find your books and the book that's coming out on Monday? Where can people
So the one-stop shop, if you really hate yourself and want to learn more about me, the one-stop shop for everything about me is joshuacutchin.com, JOSHUACUTCHIN.com. Links to all my books are there, the old stuff and the new stuff. My two newest books, Ecology of Souls, and my fictional novel, Them Old Ways Never Died, are available through Amazon. We all have misgivings about Amazon.
Yeah.
I'm well aware of that, but at the same time, their independent publishing apparatus is very robust. So I have the books that are published through traditional publishers, as well as these books that I'm publishing directly myself. And you can find all the links to that up there, as well as links to all the interviews that I've done, like this one. So if you really want to, you can just listen to me for an entire week or two nonstop. Yeah.
And find, the episode of Ancient Aliens.
And the episode of Ancient Aliens. That's a story that I'll have to share sometime. But yeah, I made it onto about, I think I timed it once. It was 18 seconds of Ancient Aliens. I was there for about 4 hours filming, and they took 18 seconds because I was, again, the way that I tend to approach these topics isn't really soundbite appropriate, because it's talking about mythology and folklore and belief and all these things. And so anyway, but it was a great opportunity, and I'd go again, but I'm going to say what I think as opposed to what I think people want to hear. So,
but that's maintaining your integrity and authenticity, and staying true, and allows you to sleep at night.
Yeah, it was challenging at some points, but yeah, I stayed the course. That's what some of my mentors and advisors told me. They're like, just whatever you do, just don't say anything that you don't want to take back. So that's
right. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you being on the show and agreeing. And
this was so much fun. I really appreciate it too, and the time flew by.
It did, and it was a great conversation. I'd love to have you back again.
Absolutely.
At another point in time. So thank you to all of the listeners. Thank you to everybody that had comments. A big shout out to the United Public Radio Network and the UFO Paranormal Radio Network, 105.3 and 107.7. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone.